This is the Collector Car Podcast, the home for the auto enthusiast. Join GStanley as he applies over 25 years of insights and analytical experience to the collector car market. He will interview the experts and throw in some fun stuff as well.
Well, today we have a really cool guest. A couple weeks ago, I had a podcast all about Corvette values. Well, today we have a Corvette expert, so I'd like to welcome Derek Moore. Derek, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, and I'm happy to talk about Corvette history and all things Corvette and hopefully some other stuff, too.
Yeah, we definitely go into some tangents. Now, you're the Director of Collections and the Curator at the National Corvette Museum, correct?
Yes, Director of Collections and Curator, yeah.
Okay, so for our average tourist, what does that mean?
I get that question a lot. What does that person do? So basically, anytime you're in a museum, all museums typically have curators. Most have some type of Director of Collections. And basically, we oversee all of the artifacts you see on display and the exhibits that are, you're actually walking through in the museum and really the narrative story that's being told within the museum.
Wow, that's really cool. Now, I have another podcast that's all about careers, and typically on this podcast, I don't ask people about their careers because it's all about cars, but I am curious, how did you end up at the National Corvette Museum?
That is a interesting story and hopefully not too long. But I grew up, and probably plays into the car story as well. But I grew up restoring cars with my father. He had a restoration shop back in Michigan where I grew up. But when I was a kid, he restored cars, but he was also a GM body man, body technician at dealerships. But he happened to be the body guy that was most interested in fiberglass and went to all of the Corvette classes at Tech Center. And so we restored a lot of Corvettes along the way. He told me he didn't want to see me go into, just being a body guy or trade or anything like that. You should go to college and, get a degree and get a good job and all that. And, of course, now it's like, well, the trades are actually a good place to be. But
right.
So I went off to college, did what your parents hope you'd do. But I was actually going to be a chemistry major and took a history class that kind of changed my mind on history and got me more interested in it. And wound up in a museum studies program. And wound up getting my foot in the door at Henry Ford Museum, Greenfield Village up in Dearborn, Michigan, back when I still lived back in Michigan, and started my career off there. Worked there for about 8 years, I guess it was, in the conservation department, taking care of the transportation collection there. Actually had opportunity to run a lot of the cars there, do stuff like that. And then moved on to a museum in Cleveland, Ohio, called the Crawford Auto Aviation Museum, and I was curator there for about a little over, I think it was 5 years. And then the Corvette Museum was looking for a curator about 4 years ago, and kind of asked me to apply for it, and interviewed me and offered me the job, which I accepted. And that was, I've been here just over 3 years. So interestingly, it kind of came full circle because I started out kind of as a kid growing up in a GM family and working on Corvettes a lot. And then kind of headed off and did the museum thing, wound up at the Henry Ford Museum, and kind of moved around, and now I'm back in that GM and Corvette-centric world.
Wow, that's really cool. So is there a Corvette from your childhood or starting, helping your dad out that stuck out that kind of might be kind of the taproot Corvette that got you excited, a particular generation or a specific car?
Yes, it's actually a very specific car that I hope to own one day. It's actually a good friend of my father's has a 67 Corvette, of course, last year of the second generation Corvette, what they call the second generation. He's a mechanic, and when I was a kid, he was an older, he's about my dad's age, but he had worked on a lot of early cars with the people that taught him how to be a mechanic. I learned a lot of my mechanical knowledge from my dad's friend Howie, and I was always around kind of, seeing his Corvette and, hearing it run and, all those things. And it's just that kind of Corvette that sticks out in my mind from childhood. And, of course, the connection to the owner and having him as actually kind of a mentor as a kid, teaching me how to work on all engines. I mean, everything. He taught me a lot of what I know about some of the, I collect antique cars, and, a lot of what I know about early engines actually came from Howie as well. So that 67 Corvette, he still owns to this day, and hopefully, maybe when he's ready to part with it, he might think about offering it to me, I hope.
Wow. Well, what are the specs on that car, the color, interior, options?
It is, you had to ask me that because now I can't remember the name of the color right off the top of my head.
I'm fine with blue, yellow, pink, white, whatever.
Yeah, no, it's the Goodwood green.
Oh, great color.
Darker green, yep. And then black interior, and it's the small block, so it's the 327 cubic inch and the 4-speed, but I don't know which 4-speed it is, if it's an M20, 21, or a 22. So I doubt it's the M22. That'd be a really rare car. But it is a 4-speed manual. So it's a nice car. Kind of a more, I'd call it baseline Corvette in some worlds, but still a beautiful car. And it's a coupe, so it's hardtop, not the Roadster.
Right. That's really cool. And actually, a 67 Corvette's one of my early cars. That's my favorite Corvette, actually. My uncle Jack, shout out to Uncle Jack, he has a 67 coupe that he bought like in 74, and he's been showing it since like 78, and I've been drooling over it since like 1980, and it's that marina blue with white interior, 4-speed, factory AC, side pipe, 350 horsepower car. So it's a pretty cool little small block for sure, and like I said, I've been drooling over that forever, and I've tried to buy it from him for many years, but he's going to give it to one of his daughters. So
oh, yeah.
I'm like, she's just going to do donuts in the local parking lot. You need to sell it to me, which is not true. She would take very good care of it and show it for another 40 years or so. So, wow. Well, that's really cool. Now, if you would, is there a Corvette currently or another cool car currently in your garage?
Well, actually, probably something people might be shocked to find out about me. But I actually currently don't own a Corvette. I've worked on a lot of Corvettes. I've driven around in a lot of Corvettes, but I've never owned a Corvette. As I kind of alluded to, I'm a huge fan, and I have a lot of passion around the early automobile as kind of my collecting type world. So right now, in my collection, I've got a 1917 Overland Model 90 Roadster, 1919 wow. Chevy 490 touring car, 1923 Peerless Model 66, which is one of the early American V8s. It's got a 332 cubic inch V8 engine in it. And then I do have a couple, a more modern car. I've got a 61 Ford Falcon that I actually bought when I worked at Henry Ford Museum, and it was actually kind of my daily driver, actually up till I moved here to Kentucky, but that's not because I won't drive a Ford to the Corvette Museum. It's actually because shortly before making the move, I was driving it to work one day. I lost oil pressure, and I've got it in the garage. I've fixed the oil pressure issue, but now I've kind of, in going over everything on the car, it really needs the brake system rebuilt, some things to be a little more safe as it ages. So I'm kind of slowly trying to make all the required maintenance to it and make sure it's safe to get back on the road again as one of my daily drivers. So
well, that's cool, and that's a cool collection, and we could solve your problem right now. Let's just take one of those early cars and let's just shove a LS4 engine into it and call it a day.
There you go. Yeah, maybe in the 1919 Chevy, because you'd be keeping the family lineage.
There you go. I like that.
Yeah.
I do like that. Yeah, I know everybody gets upset if they see a 32 Ford with a Chevy engine or, something like that. So that would be cool to keep it all within the family. That's really neat. Well, one of the things I gave you to do, as far as a to-do list for this podcast, was to come up with your list of the top 10 Corvettes ever, which I know is a really difficult thing to come up with. So tell me, how have you fared so far on that task?
I think I've got maybe 6 or 7 figured out. As you were just saying, it's a difficult list to come up with because you can look at so many aspects of Corvette history: the production line, the experimentals that were built, the race cars that were built, and there's so many different Corvettes within that world, and then all the different engine options that came out over time, and the different packages for essentially sneaking factory-backed race cars out of the factory during the AMA ban on racing, where they were building the Z06s in 1963, and they were a production car, but they were only being sold to race teams, So, I struggle a little bit with the list, but I would say the ones that definitely jump right off the top of the mind when you get to it, obviously you just start with the first year, 1953, because it is the pivotal year in bringing Corvette to life, proving that America is ready for a sports car of Corvette's nature, and getting this whole thing rolling now. 67 years later, we just passed the 67th birthday of Corvette, and so it all traces back to that one, those first 1953s that rolled off the line, and then of course I think. After that, you have to look at the 1955 Corvette, the first one to get the V8 in it and bring it into higher horsepower, true kind of sports car nature with a big American V8, and that European sports car styling would be probably one of those top 10 as well. And then what I just talked about, the 1963, when they bring out the second generation of Corvette, major change in the car. You go to, independent front suspension, you go, or independent rear suspension, sorry, from the solid axle years. And then you go, in 63, you've got the famous split window design of the Corvette. But you also have the Z06s coming out. You have these, race prepped spec cars. Of course, you had fuel injected engines introduced just a few years before this, so you've got amazing fuel injection technology coming out in the 63 lineup of Corvettes, which is just makes the car an incredible car, changes the whole idea of what the Corvette is. And then in that same period, in the this second generation, you can't overlook the Grand Sports, the five Grand Sports that were built to compete with the Cobras. Just the amazing battle that the Z06, the Cobra, the Grand Sport, the flip-top Cobra, just that back and forth between Corvette and Cobra, trying to defeat each other out on the track is amazing. And then as you work your way up through the years, the L88 of the late 60s, very few of those built, high horsepower, big engine.
Would that be a C2 or C3 car?
Well, they started the L88s in 67, so the last year of C2 production.
For your list, would you pick a 67 or would you pick a 68?
Ooh, wow, you have to throw that out there, don't you?
You could pick two. We only have a couple spots taken so far.
I like the styling of both the 67 and the 68. I think probably with the L88, I'd probably go with the 68 with that longer, kind of sleeker look of the body on the third generation Corvette. I don't know. To me, it gives that L88 a little, and even the kind of minor decaling they did on the L88s, and the hood, especially the C3 hood for the L88s. It's a nicely styled Corvette.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Keep on going. I didn't mean to interrupt your timeline here because you're doing great, but I wanted to get clarification on that L88.
Yeah, not a problem. And I'm sure this is my list. I'm sure somebody out there is going to be like, well, he missed this, this, and this, but
right.
And then you get up through the years, and I think again in a historical context of top 10 Corvettes, you have to look at essentially the 1983 production 1984 Corvette. Of course, 83 is the only year they don't build a Corvette. We have the one and only Corvette, 1983 Corvette here at the museum, and that's in my opinion, and what I always tell people is, that the C4, the introduction of fourth generation, what we call the C4 Corvettes, is really the beginning of the change from American sports car to America's supercar, where they're starting to get ready to go up against Ferrari and Lamborghini and all of the European, essentially what are moving from sports cars, European sports cars, into the European supercar market, and that is Corvette's transition period, where they really go from the high horsepower, brute, engines to a lot of computer technology that's going to develop through the fourth generation and become essentially the car we know today. Because during that fourth generation, they play with active handling, magnetic ride control, all the different things that lead to the C5, 6, 7, and now what we have with the C8 Corvette. So that is a pivotal time. And, of course, the story, even just the story behind the 1983 and why they couldn't get it into production and had to hold off till 1984 is, really a pivotal story in Corvette history, because it could have been the end of Corvette, but it wasn't.
Could you give us a brief little overview, like a cliff notes as far as that situation for our listeners?
Yeah, so basically 83, what they're doing is they know in the early 80s they're going to be moving to the new generation. They're designing it, they're engineering it, they're working very diligently on getting the fourth generation together, and it is a major change. It is a huge change from the C3. You have to remember the 1982 Corvette, third generation, that chassis is essentially the same chassis as a 1963 Corvette. Very minor changes. I mean, that chassis had a long run, and they're trying to completely rewrite the way Corvette is engineered, designed, everything about it. And when they get the pilot cars built late in 82, and start sorting through them for 83 production, well, in 82 they're working on it. Basically what they find is that they're trying to make so many changes. They're trying this drastic makeover of Corvette that, they're having problems figuring out, the newer federal emission standards. They're having troubles figuring out, proper panel fit and body fit and paint finishes with the new materials they're using in the body. Just all kinds of things that essentially Chevrolet says this is not up to Corvette standard. Number one, we're having issues with, federal regulations, some of the federal regulations, making sure we're going to meet them in time, but also just the fit and finish of the car is not Corvette standard. And so they made the decision to run the 1982 production year longer, and that's what led to the collector's edition 1982 Corvette, and then the 1984 production year starts early. So actually, we get a lot of calls from people that it's interesting. People are like, I just ran my VIN and I have an 83 Corvette. Well, they started production early, basically before what the federal government lists VIN numbers changing over to the next model year as. So early 84 Corvettes, if you were to go to like AutoZone to get a part, or any of the big parts companies that you can get parts from, if they run your VIN and it's an early enough one, it actually comes up in their system as a 1983 because the VIN standards were registered in 83 instead of the 84 model year. But in all actuality, there is only one 1983 Corvette left in existence, and that is here.
So everybody's thinking, oh my gosh, I have the second one.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah, there were 43 pilot cars built, and 42 were crushed. So we know that the one and only is here at the museum.
Wow, that's really cool. Now let's recap. Let's see. So I think you're through the first 5. Correct me if I'm wrong here. 53?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know if I...
Yeah, let me see.
Keep track.
1953, 1963 split window, a Grand Sport, the 68 L88, and the 83 car. Those are what I have so far. Does that sound right?
Well, you skipped the 55 with the introduction of the V8.
Ah, sorry, 55. All right, so you're up to 6.
Yes, yeah, I'm up to 6, and that's the struggle. And then so what I was talking about with the fourth generation of Corvette, I think that's when you start. There's milestones, and then you can start looking at what happens during a production run that kind of forms Corvette. So 1989 and 1990, the big introduction from the Corvette world is the fourth generation ZR1.
Right.
And, everybody, most people think, oh, the ZR1, they think C4. But we have to remember, the ZR1 was actually a package during the C3 generation as well. There were very, very few built. They're a very rare car. But there was actually a ZR1 package back in 1970, and I think it was 70 and 71. 2 years they ran. Actually, I think they did it into 72. They did it into 72. There was, but such a low number, nobody seems to remember those cars. And they didn't have special badging that said ZR1. It was just a package you could get on the car back in the third generation. But the fourth generation, you get the ZR1, and of course you get the wide body, the special rear end, fascia. You get this kind of different stylized Corvette come out, much higher horsepower. You have a key in those in the C4 ZR1s to go from basically valet mode, which is low horsepower, to full power mode. And so you can actually turn the horsepower up and down in those cars with two settings. And, they're just an incredible car. The handling on them, the suspension design, a fantastic track car for the for 89, 90. These things were incredible cars to take out on track. But with the ZR1 program, they start playing around with what they can do with Corvette even more than just what they did with the ZR1, and that's when you get cars like the active handling cars. They did six active handling suspension cars. They build, of course, Viper comes out right around that time, so they're looking at a V10 powered competitor to Corvette. So they start bringing out cars like the Snake Skinner. Of course, Snake Skinner, a direct kind of hit at Viper.
Right.
Then they also do with Falconer. They do the ZR12 Corvette, which was known as Conan the Corvette. And they start playing around with the chassis, the engineering, the design. They do some other big block Corvettes at that time, all based around the ZR1, and it all leads to further development towards the fifth generation Corvette. So I think that ZR1 in 1989 and 90 is a pivotal time in Corvette history because it's another leap forward in the engineering of the car.
Yeah, and I remember those came out new, and I was about 16, 17 at the time, and I was just in love with those cars, and I thought that key, the extra key was like so cool. It was like mind-blowing as a 16-year-old that this thing has so much horsepower. You have to turn a key to get more, that kind of thing. So that was really, really, really cool. Well, you got 3 more spots here. So what are the final 3?
Oh, man. This may be an odd one to anybody that's a Corvette fan that listens to the podcast. And it may be a personal interest of mine, but it's kind of also an interesting story in Corvette history. But in 1999 and 2000, Corvette did the fixed roof coupes, what most people reference as the FRC. And, it was really them, Corvette looking at possibly doing a car that they might be able to build a little cheaper. To try to bring the price down a little further. Of course, you don't have to put a target top in. You're going to save costs, especially on the structure because you're not having a part of the roof be removable. So they were trying to look at some cost savings, and it led to this, the 99 and 2000 fixed roof coupe, which only those 2 years, because then in 2001, the fixed roof coupe, because of the rigidness of the car with that roof that no longer has to have a target top in it, turns into the Z06.
Right.
The 2001 Z06 Corvette. They did not have a target top. They were a fixed roof coupe. So that fixed roof coupe, although it was an attempt to start looking at an idea of lowering the price of Corvette even more than, most people call Corvette, kind of the common man sports car, because it's much cheaper than a Ferrari or any other European car of its, that's of its caliber. They were looking at, can we bring the price down a little further? But then when they realized how rigid the car became, they could put a higher horsepower engine in it, and they brought out the Z06 again with that fixed roof coupe. So, I think that's an interesting timeline in the C5 story, is that the fixed roof coupe and what it turns into, bringing the Z06 name back into Corvette's, lineage.
Yeah, that's actually sneaky good, because I could expect the Z06 of that era, being on your list, but not just a fixed roof coupe. So that's a great call out. I like that a lot. Okay.
I mean, that's what I guess, that's what I love about, kind of curating a collection and, looking at things in a little different way is, the Z06 was amazing, the high horsepower, all that, but how were they able to do it? And we got to step back and go, oh, the fixed roof coupe and the story of that leads us to that. And I think that's the kind of stories, especially when I do an exhibit here at the museum, I like to try to get into those a little bit, I guess you call it a, technological rabbit hole that you dive down to kind of learn a little more about the backstory.
Wow. Okay. So you've got 2 more spots, and I think we've had every generation except for C6, C7. Let's see, C6, C7.
Uh-oh. That means I got it tied between the C6 and the C7 generation.
So what is next? And you don't have to pick one per generation. You don't have to pick that.
Oh yeah, and I didn't intend to.
Right.
I don't. I think I got a couple C1s in there. I think I might have got a couple C2s, and
yep.
So I'm jumping around a bit. But probably the next one I would have to say the ninth pick here, and I'm not, notice I'm not doing them like, Dave Letterman or something would do it, where I'm counting them down or counting them up. I'm just randomly putting 10 out there. Right. This is, I would probably say the 2019 ZR1. They bring the ZR1 name back for the, final year of production of the 7th generation. But essentially, the engineers at Corvette and the designers basically squeeze every last ounce of everything they have in the front engine Corvette out of the car in the ZR1, and build an insane car that really, who needs it for street driving? It's truly a car that belongs pretty much only on the racetrack. I mean, there are a lot of them out there, guys. People own them, drive them on the street, and they drive them wisely and safely. But there's more horsepower in that car than you will ever use on the public roads. But it was their, kind of nod at, this is the absolute limit of a front-engine car in the Corvette. And this is, here you go, here is the absolute limit before we move to what Zora had always wanted, which was the mid-engine Corvette. So I think that ZR1 is kind of that final hurrah of the engineers.
I was waiting for that ZR1 to pop in, so I'm glad it did.
Yeah. And then I'm sure you can probably guess what the 10th car is.
Well, I'm going to let you say it. So now it's time for in no particular order, but this is the 10th car on your list. So what is that car?
That would be the 2020 Stingray mid-engine Corvette.
I did see that one coming. So yes, fantastic
and that's not,
car.
I mean, not trying to, put out there like, oh, it's such a great car, anything, and it's just, it is the and the mid-engine exhibit that we're doing here at the museum now that we worked with GM on, it's the title of the exhibit is The Vision Realized. And that's truly what the 2020 Stingray is. It is Zora's vision finally realized. The mid-engine Corvette is here. It's in production. It is for the general public to own and have. And, it's a dream, 60 years in the making. And, I mean, and a lot of people, out there would say, well, yeah, Zora had that dream, but, would he have still been pushing for that dream, now? I mean, would he, and I always point out, you've got to remember that when, Zora was essentially becoming, the head engineer of Corvette. Although he never truly held the title of like chief engineer or anything like that. 1954, he's taking a leave of absence from Chevrolet engineering to go over to France, get in a Porsche factory race car, mid-engine sports car, and win Le Mans.
Right.
He
Right.
understood mid-engine cars. He knew their capabilities. Yes, he would still be pushing for a mid-engine Corvette to this day. I mean, that was he knew what they were capable of, and with the advancements in technology, I mean, they're only capable of more than what they used to be. So, I think I always try to remind people, Zora was the guy that was driving mid-engine sports cars before he even really came to Corvette. I mean, he was driving them long before he was hired at Chevrolet, and racing in them. And I mean, it is truly Zora's vision realized.
Yes, and I was at Amelia Island, and I saw the mid-engine display there of all the Corvettes, all the prototypes, and it wasn't like there was just one. I mean, there was like, I don't know how many, but there was over 10, I'd say, that spanned many generations of Corvettes.
Yeah, and a few of those cars have been destroyed. They've a few of the mid-engine Corvettes over time were just thought to not be really important in development history, so they've actually crushed them or modified them into something else along the way. So there are some that don't even exist anymore. But yeah, we were actually the Corvette Museum was proud to be part of that lineup because we actually in our collection have XP987 GT, which is the two-rotor Corvette. Back when they were doing the rotary engine experiments. So we were one of those wonderful mid-engine cars lined up there by the C8 display.
Oh, wow, that's really cool. Well, now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but doesn't the new C8, isn't the base model faster than the C7 ZR1, like 0 to 60, something crazy like that?
They both will go 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. So the C7 ZR1, 0 to 60 under 3 seconds, and the base model 2020 Stingray, 0 to 60 in under 3 seconds. So that right there tells you, they squeezed every last ounce of energy out of the front engine, but the mid-engine has a long way to go.
Right, it sure does. Yeah, and it's a beautiful car on top of everything else. Now, what color would you want your C8 in?
Great question. I've actually played around on the website there for the C8 where you can build your own, and I, of course, have to ask my wife her opinions too. Got to make sure she's happy, and we are actually stuck between two colors. We have the Blade Silver, which is my favorite, Blade Silver with a black interior, black accents, things like that on it. Just kind of a very clean, almost throwback to the original, 63 Stingray look of some of the show cars that were silver with black interior. But then my wife actually saw one of the ceramic matrix gray C8s here at the museum, and although she did not like the color on the C7s, she absolutely loves it on the C8s. So we're kind of stuck between two colors right now.
Well, that's a tough place to be, I'll tell you. Yeah, that's really cool. I did notice on the new Corvette that color does make a big difference. It really calls out, the angles a lot more, if it's a white versus a black, so you really have to pay attention to the colors to see exactly what you want from your Corvette, for sure.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned before you had a kind of some cool stuff dropped off from GM today before this podcast. What kind of cool stuff was dropped off?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we have we're kind of finalizing the installation of the Vision Realized. People can walk through it. It's just not 100% yet, of course, thanks to the pandemic and all of the shutdowns. But GM was dropping off this morning 3 of those mid-engine concept vehicles to put in the exhibit. So this morning we welcomed Zr1, which is the first mid-engine car that Zora builds at Chevrolet, along with the Astro 2 and then Reynolds Aluminum, both mid-engine concept cars, into the museum and into the exhibit, which already has car known as XP819, often referred to as the Ugly Duckling. That is the only fully rear-engined attempt at a Corvette concept car. So, you got to remember a rear mid-engined car is an engine just in front of the rear axle, and a rear-engined car is one with the engine actually behind the rear axle. So, that's kind of that designation difference. So in Chevrolet history, or GM history, Corvair was a rear-engine car, and Fiero was a mid-engine car. Best way for some people to maybe think about it. But we do have the Ugly Duckling here. Of course, the two-rotor is in the exhibit because it's our car. The Indy concept from the 1980s is here. And we also obviously have 2020 C8 Corvette on display for everyone to see.
Right. Okay. Now, how could our listeners learn more about the museum and events coming up soon?
Oh, that's easy. You just go to CorvetteMuseum.org, and all the information about the museum is on there. Of course, right now, what everybody is asking about, all the safety measures we're taking during this time in history. So you can read all about that, and but you can also find out our hours of operation, our admissions prices, discounts on that for senior veterans, all that. But then also all the different exhibit information up there. There's links to our store, so you don't even have to come here and shop. You can shop online. And then, also, probably some of your listeners know, we also have a motorsports park just across I-65. And you can also find links to all the events that happen over at the Motorsports Park on our website as well.
Wow. Okay. That is really cool. Now, one thing I do at the end here, and I did give you a heads up, so you've been a great sport so far, so hopefully you'll be a great sport for a little bit longer, is my little game I called Keep, Cash, and Crush. And so I give you 3 cars, and you have to tell me which one you want to keep forever, which one you don't mind cashing in, and then which one you're going to send to the crusher. So it's going to be difficult, but, people like that. So are you ready?
I am ready.
All right. This is going to be difficult when 2 of the 3 cars you actually mentioned in the interview. So that's probably not a good sign for you. So, because you mentioned a lot of really special cars. And one of them's on your top 10 list, ironically enough. So let's start with that. So one of the cars is the 1983 Corvette, one of one. One of the cars is a 2019 ZR1 pre-production car. And then the third car is another one you mentioned, which I had honestly never heard of before this call, my research prior to the call, a 1991 Snake Skinner, the SS1 or 2. So those are your 3 cars, 2019 ZR1 pre-production, 1983 Corvette, or 1991 Snake Skinner. Which one would you want to keep forever? Which one would you cash in? And which one would you send to the crusher?
So I feel like I'm getting set up here because you picked 3 cars that actually exist in the museum collection.
So I didn't know the pre-production I didn't know the Snake Skinner was there. Okay.
Yeah,
cool.
So we have the 83. We actually have the Dubai reveal car of the ZR1, the one that Tom Peters and Ted drove out in Dubai. We have that car here, and we have Snake Skinner 2 in the collection as well.
That wasn't my intent, but it worked out really well.
I feel like I'm getting set up here, because no matter what I say. So let's see. We have to do, keep, crush, and cash.
Keep, cash, and crush. Yeah.
So I have to keep one, cash one in, and crush one. You're not very kind. You're not very kind, Greg. Well, obviously the keep would have to be the 83 Corvette. The significance of that car is beyond anything.
This is where I leave in all the dead silence.
Yeah. Let's go. Okay, so here's my theory. Okay, this is my reasoning and my theory. Okay, 1983 Corvette, keep, very significant car to Corvette history, needs to be saved. Cash in, the either Snake Skinner 1 or Snake Skinner 2 would be the cash in, because the car would still survive, it just wouldn't be in my hands. And the crush would be the pre-production ZR1 because there are production versions of that car that can be had and refill that void of crushing that car.
Very well thought out. I like that. I would have done the same exact as you. So, yeah, that's good. And a lot of the pre-production stuff was crushed anyways, right?
Yes, usually anything pre-production is crushed. Occasionally, they'll save some of those cars at the Heritage Center, or occasionally we can get our hands on one, being the museum, being that they know it's not ever going to leave here. They'll occasionally, like the Dubai reveal car, they'll send it here. So.
All right. So on top of everything that you do at the museum, it's my understanding that you also have an automotive podcast that you might want to share with our listeners.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I probably get myself into way too much with the antique cars and the job and everything else. But yeah, I also co-host a podcast, automotive podcast, called No Driving Gloves, with a couple of guys, from different. Basically, we brought together people from different ends of the automotive industry. So we've got a host that is a hot rod builder, has a big hot rod shop down in Alabama. A gentleman who builds racing simulators, which are hot right now, obviously. And another gentleman who has been a collector for years, also worked in the museum field. That's actually how he and I got to know each other. But all with just a little bit different perspective on the automotive industry and the hobby. And it's kind of like your podcast. It's just kind of a loose, conversational podcast, family friendly. And we put out typically one a week, sometimes some bonus episodes for our listeners. But yeah, I would encourage, hopefully you get a chance to listen to it sometime, and maybe even we'd love to have you on.
Cool. And that's called No Driving Gloves, correct?
Yes.
Well, cool. Well, thank you for sharing your passion for Corvettes with us today, and for coming up with the top 10 list, and for playing Keep Cash and Crush. I really appreciate it.
Not a problem, Greg. It was fun being on the show, and I look forward to talking with you more in the future, maybe.
Thanks for listening to the Collector Car Podcast. Don't forget to give us a nice rating on iTunes, and be sure to follow us on Instagram and everywhere else at the Collector Car Podcast.